If you're not sure about the difference between a bank and a building society, then you need to know this. The genuine mutual is virtually extinct now, but the old-fashioned, solid-as-a-rock building society enjoyed a simple logic. It worked like this. If a group of savers and borrowers wanted to start a building society and to lend out, say, £50 million in mortgages, then they required to attract £50 million from saving members. To do this, they needed to offer interest at, say, 5%, because the savers deserve a reward for giving up the use of their money. The society can then lend out the £50 million at 6%, making a gross margin of £500,000. Real assets equal real liabilities. Now, the bank lending out £50 million appears very similar, but observe the magic of banking. Here the promoter requires to find only £5 million to capitalise his bank, a 10% reserve ratio, so 90% of his loans are simply credit contracts. The money doesn't actually exist in real terms. The bank profits from the interest, and when the loan is repaid, it doesn't matter if the money is decimated by 20 years of inflation, because it was never any more than a book entry in the first place. Bank assets are largely notional money, but as we all know now, their liabilities are real money. The customer's deposits in a bank are used as working capital, helping to finance the trading book and meet regulatory ratios. Not difficult to see, therefore, why banks are more profitable than building societies. The key difference here is the building society is like you and me. If I lend you £1,000, then I go without the use of that money until it's repaid. In the case of the bank, no one forgoes the use of any money when credit is granted, yet the borrower can step outside to the cash machine and draw out real money. This delegates all control over the national currency from the state to private companies, to say nothing of undermining the money supply. It's at the heart of the problem, and it's interesting to note that in the 200-year history of building societies there has only been one failure, in 1892, due to embezzlement by the founder. The mint, another old-fashioned practice. Before bank credit virtually replaced real money, it was minted by governments. It used to be gold and silver coin, and even the paper money was exchangeable. But then there wasn't enough precious metal around to keep the wheels turning, and all countries adopted fiat currencies, paper money of no intrinsic value, but guaranteed by the state. Not so long ago, half of all our money was printed by the state, and the other half was bank credit. All this nice new fiat money was in great demand by the banks, and it was delivered by a fleet of armoured vans. But this was no free lunch for bankers. Every penny was credited to the government's seigneurage account, and when some public asset or investment was required, the government drew a cheque on its seigneurage account to pay for it. Back then, half our money was free of debt and spent into circulation backed by public assets. The other half was bank credit, mainly for businesses back then. The loss of seigneurage has created a huge burden of direct and indirect taxation, and regular cuts in public services have become commonplace. The move from cash to credit has pushed our money system from neutral, spent into circulation by the state, into unrepayable debt, loaned into circulation by the banks. Now, no one is arguing against credit. It's much more efficient and convenient than cash. It's how it originates that requires changing. This reform proposes that the national credit, which over the past year we have seen pumped into the banking system in multiple billions, will replace the old cash system. It will be formally issued to the banks and credited to the seigneurage account. This will replace the bank's private variety of credit with the genuine article, and it will become illegal for any private citizen, including banks, to print or otherwise originate the national currency or credit. But under reform, the bulk of bank loans will be funded from personal savings, just as were the old building societies. Only a small proportion of new or additional money will source free of debt from seigneurage. As the population lives longer, so also will savings become even more important, and funding the real economy with real money guaranteed by the state is a far more rational hold for pension funds rather than a volatile stock market. Many people don't appreciate that less than 2% of stock market transactions actually raise new capital for companies. Now, there's nothing wrong with financial speculation, but not with other people's money. Accountability and transparency will return to the democratic process. We now know that when bankers control the national credit, the abuse is too great, the cost of borrowing is too high, and the reward for saving is too low. Equally important, monetary policy gets some long overdue teeth. Professor Blanchflower, late of the Monetary Policy Committee, advocated £90 billion worth of public spending on shovel-ready projects to get the UK economy moving. The bankers condemned this New Deal Keynesian solution as unaffordable. Yet here we have demonstrated that we can have Keynes without debt. The engineers also tell us there's nothing like this amount of construction work ready to go. And anyway, the option isn't even practical because, as we've seen, even if you give the bank some money, they won't necessarily lend it out. We have just dealt with all these criticisms. Because constitutional money rather than debt, the banks enter the process only when these cheques are paid in and the contractor's accounts are in credit, in direct payment for assets created. That means, of course, that central and local authorities should have planning consent and designed infrastructure ready for tender as an ongoing strategy to optimise capacity as and when it becomes available. We must break the mindset that the state is the creature of the banking system. It is not. On the contrary, the state grants a licence to the banks under the Constitution. The Banking Acts must be amended to prevent the origination of the national credit by any authority other than the state. The national currency is a neutral facilitator and not the private fiefdom of any bank. It is simply not their money. This is Howard Christie's painting, The Signing of the US Constitution in 1787. If we have learned anything from the banking disaster, it must be that the future is not a matter for private banking interests to decide. It's not even a matter of political opinion. It is even more fundamental. It is a matter for the Constitution. Ever since banks were granted their special chartered status, they have demonstrated their ingenuity and ability to undermine constitutional principles once considered inviolate. Any monetary economist or student of central banking can recite a litany of bitter historic political battles fought over whether private banks were better than governments at managing the national currency. Perhaps the earliest and best documented of these is the Jefferson-Hamilton conflict of 1791, probably the first serious challenge to the new US Constitution, and not fully resolved until 1913, when Woodrow Wilson passed the Federal Reserve Act into law, virtually privatizing the US dollar, something he deeply regretted after demitting office in 1919. It was an act which fundamentally altered the character of America.
And in 1913, with heavy political sponsorship by the bankers, Woodrow Wilson became president, having already agreed to sign the Federal Reserve Act in exchange for campaign support. And 2 days before Christmas, when most of Congress was at home with their families, the Federal Reserve Act was voted in, and Wilson in turn made it law. Years later, Woodrow Wilson wrote, in regret,
"I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction with the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men. He who pays the piper calls the tune, and we all know that banking is privately owned and independent of government. We cannot trust the bankers, and too many politicians have feet of clay. As Franklin Roosevelt said, there must be provision for an adequate and sound currency. Well, in these final few moments, let me tell you we'll get it only when it's written into the Constitution and defended as vigorously as all the other rights of being a citizen in a democratic state. This is no place for an academic paper. But let me quote a few snippets from one delivered last year by Professor James M. Buchanan, a Nobel Prize-winning university lecturer in economics. It's entitled "The Constitutionalization of Money." I quote, "Statements that capitalism or the market has failed are misleading. It is the monetary and banking system which has failed. At least since 1971, there has been no commodity basis for money. Instead, the commercial world has been described as embodying a pure paper or fiat unit of exchange and account. So there is no justification for traditional banking that allows for the generation of multiple account values from fractional reserve bases. The central logic of leverage banking of any sort is absent under the operation of a pure fiat monetary system. The modern dilemma is that we are left with a massive resource-using financial banking structure that has a functional purpose quite different from that which is widely accepted. It makes no sense under a fiat system. The monetary unit must be made one of the rules of the game within which economic interaction takes place, rather than being used as a counter in the strategy of play within the rules." So Professor Buchanan is among many eminent economists who endorse the view that tinkering with the present banking structure is fiddling while Rome burns. Separating off the casino element would be a short step back from the edge, but to leave bankers in charge of the national credit leaves us all still mired in debt and economic stagnation. In the fraud which is our banking system, white-collar crime has become so entrenched in custom as to be almost beyond challenge. Even when destroyed by its own excess, and against all rational expectation, it has, like a virus, been sustained and reconstructed by its very own victims. There is only one certainty: the corruption, the misery, and the conflict will not go away until we can rescue democratic accountability from the clutches of the banking system. And that means us all taking the initiative. There are dozens of groups across the internet dedicated to banking reform. Find one you like and join in. Together we can make a difference. Thanks for listening.